Ever wondered what happened when you died in medieval times? Did your wife get anything? Could your daughter inherit your castle? Medieval inheritance and dowry laws were wild, bizarre, and sometimes downright cruel. From bizarre animal exchanges to strict gender-based restrictions that would make modern lawyers faint, these ancient rules shaped families for centuries. Number 8. The mourning gift pay for play medieval style. Have you heard about the mourning gift? It sounds innocent enough, right? Well, think again. In medieval Germanic traditions, the mourning gift, or Morgengabe, was a property or money gift given by a husband to his wife the morning after their wedding night. Yes, literally, the morning after consummation. Talk about putting a price on performance. This wasn't just some cute tradition. It was serious business. The mourning gift served as a form of financial security for the new bride, especially if her husband died early in the marriage. The more generous the gift, the more impressed everyone would be with both the husband's wealth and his satisfaction with the wedding night. In Anglo-Saxon England, these mourning gifts could be quite substantial. Records show cases where husbands gifted entire estates, villages, or precious metals. King Canute gave his wife, Emma, the city of Exeter as a mourning gift. Talk about setting the bar high for other husbands. The mourning gift was completely separate from the dowry which came from the bride's family. This was the groom's personal gift to his bride, and once given, it was legally hers. She could manage it, profit from it, and in many cases pass it on to her children or other heirs when she died. What makes this law so strange by modern standards is how explicitly it connected the marital bed to property transfer. The gift was only valid after consummation, creating an awkward financial incentive system around what we'd now consider a private matter. Medieval court records actually contain cases where mourning gifts were disputed because a marriage allegedly wasn't consummated. Can you imagine having to prove such a thing in court? The tradition eventually evolved and diminished over centuries, but it shows just how differently medieval society viewed marriage, as an economic and political transaction where even intimate relations had property implications. Number 7. Heriot. Your lord gets your best beast when you die. Did you know your landlord could legally take your favorite horse when you died? In medieval England, a law called heriot required that when a tenant died, their lord could claim their best animal or another valuable possession as payment. This strange death tax originated from Anglo-Saxon military customs. Initially, when a warrior died, his weapons and armor were returned to his lord, who had often provided them in the first place. But as feudal society developed, this military obligation transformed into an economic one that applied to all tenants, not just warriors. The typical heriot was the best animal owned by the deceased, usually a horse or ox. For wealthier tenants, it might be their finest horse, with saddle and bridle. For peasants who owned little, it might be their only cow or working animal which could devastate the surviving family's ability to farm and support themselves. What made heriot particularly brutal was that it took priority over all other claims on the estate, including family needs. The lord's agent would literally show up at the funeral or soon after to select and take the best animal before the inheritance could be distributed. Imagine mourning your father while watching the lord's representative lead away the prize bull your family depends on. Some clever families tried to dodge heriot by transferring ownership of valuable animals before death. But lords caught on and established legal precedents against such deathbed gifts. Court records from the period show numerous disputes over heriot claims, with lords aggressively pursuing their entitlements. The practice varied widely across England, with some areas having more generous customs than others. In some regions, women were exempt from paying heriot, while in others, they were charged at a lower rate. Lords sometimes showed mercy by accepting cash instead of taking crucial working animals. But this wasn't guaranteed. Heriot persisted well into the early modern period in some areas of England, though it gradually became less common as feudal relationships declined. The practice shows just how different property concepts were in medieval times. In many ways, you never fully owned your possessions if you were a tenant. Your lord retained an interest in your property that could be claimed at your death, a concept completely at odds with modern inheritance ideas. Number 6. Dower by the bedpost. The importance of being in the right room. Did you think getting married was as simple as saying, for medieval women, where you stood during your wedding vows could determine whether you'd starve or thrive as a widow. Enter the bizarre legal concept of dower by the bedpost, a rule stipulating that, for a bride to secure her widow's rights, the marriage had to be formalized in a specific location. In parts of medieval England and France, a bride could only claim her dower rights, the portion of her husband's property she'd receive as a widow. If the marriage ceremony took place at the church door, followed by a formal announcement of the dower at the bedroom door. Yes, you read that correctly. The bedroom door. The ritual was remarkably specific. After the church ceremony, the wedding party would process to the marital bedroom. At the threshold, before witnesses, the groom would formally announce what property his bride would receive should she outlive him. Sometimes, he would symbolically hand her a key or token representing the property. Only then would the couple enter the bedroom to consummate the marriage. If this peculiar doorway ritual wasn't performed properly, a widow could find herself in serious trouble after her husband's death. Court records show numerous cases of widows struggling to claim their dower because witnesses couldn't confirm the bedroom door declaration had taken place. Some desperate widows even bribed witnesses to testify that the ritual had been properly observed when it hadn't. The bedpost connection came from cases where no formal bedroom existed for common people. Instead, the declaration might happen at the foot of the bed itself, with the bedpost serving as the symbolic boundary between public ceremony and private consummation. What makes this law particularly strange is how it merged the public legal transaction with the intimate, private sphere. Today we consider it bizarre to have legal rights contingent on bedroom-adjacent ceremonies. But for medieval people, this spatial ritual helped distinguish legitimate marriages from clandestine ones and protected women's financial interest. The church eventually grew uncomfortable with these bedroom-adjacent rituals and worked to move all marriage ceremonies fully into the church proper. By the late medieval period, the church door and bedpost dower announcements were gradually replaced by written contracts, though the tradition lingered in some rural areas well into the 16th century. Number 5. The widow's quarantine. 40 days trapped in your home. What would you do if you couldn't leave your house for over a month after your husband died? For medieval widows, this wasn't a hypothetical question. Under a strange law known as the widow's quarantine, a woman was required to remain in her husband's primary residence for exactly 40 days following his death. She couldn't leave at all. This peculiar legal concept appears most famously in the Magna Carta of 1215, which states that a widow shall have her quarantine for 40 days after the death of her husband, within which period her dower shall be assigned to her. During this time, she was entitled to food and basics from her husband's estate, regardless of whether she would ultimately inherit anything. The term quarantine comes from the French quarantaine, meaning a period of 40 days, the same root as our modern quarantine for isolating the sick. But this wasn't about disease. It was about property rights and preventing hasty remarriages that might complicate inheritance. During these 40 days, the widow was in a strange legal limbo. She couldn't be forced out of the home, even by her husband's heirs. If the home was a castle or manor, she had the right to occupy the great hall, often the most important room. The heir had to provide reasonable estovers, necessities, including food, drink, firewood, and candles from the estate. What made this law particularly bizarre is that it effectively imprisoned widows in what might be an increasingly hostile household. Imagine mourning your husband while living under the same roof as impatient heirs who viewed you as an inconvenient expense. Court records contain numerous accounts of heirs who tried to make the quarantine period miserable for widows, hoping they would leave voluntarily. For wealthy widows awaiting valuable dower properties, the quarantine could become dangerous. There were documented cases of widows barricading themselves in rooms when threatened by hostile family members. Some widows brought friends or relatives to stay with them for protection during the quarantine period. The purpose of the quarantine was supposedly to give officials time to calculate and assign the widow's dower, her share of her husband's estate, typically 1/3 of his property. But it also served to prevent the widow from absconding with valuable household items before the inventory could be completed. The widow's quarantine persisted in English common law for centuries, though enforcement became less stringent over time. This strange combination of right to remain in the home and restriction unable to leave highlights the precarious position of medieval widows, technically protected by law, but often vulnerable in practice. Number 4. Maritagium. The daughter discount system. Ever thought about trading your daughter for a tax break? In medieval England, there was actually a system for that. The legal concept of maritagium, marriage gift, created a bizarre property arrangement that treated daughters as both valuable commodities and financial liabilities simultaneously. Maritagium was a portion of land or property that a father gave to his daughter and her husband upon marriage. Think of it as a medieval starter home, explicitly given to help the young couple establish themselves. But here's where things get weird. This property came with significant strings attached. Unlike regular inherited land that would have owed feudal services, military service taxes, etc., to the lord, maritagium lands were often granted free and quit of such services for 3 generations. This meant that the lord of the manor received no services or payments from these properties for up to a century. Unsurprisingly, lords weren't thrilled about losing revenue this way. To compensate for this loss, a strange practice emerged. Daughters who received maritagium were often excluded from inheriting additional property from their fathers. Court records contain numerous cases of sisters fighting over inheritance because those who had received maritagium were considered to have already received their fair share. The size of the maritagium typically corresponded to the prestige of the marriage. A father might offer a larger marriage portion to attract a higher status husband for his daughter. This created an awkward system where daughters essentially came with price tags, and fathers had to decide how much land they were willing to spend on each daughter's marital prospects. What makes maritagium particularly strange is that it created a 3-way property relationship between father, daughter, and son-in-law. The property rights were complicated typically. The husband controlled the land during the marriage, but couldn't permanently sell it without his wife's consent. If the wife died without children, the land often reverted to her father's family rather than staying with her husband. By the 14th century, this complex system began to break down as cash dowries became more common than land grants. But for centuries, the maritagium system treated daughters as both assets to be invested through advantageous marriages and liabilities to be compensated for through their exclusion from further inheritance. Number 3. The widow's free bench and the riding of the black ram. Would you ride a black ram backward into court while reciting a lewd rhyme to regain your property rights? For some medieval English widows, this wasn't a bizarre hypothetical, but an actual legal procedure they might consider. In several English manors, particularly in the counties of Surrey and Berkshire, a unique custom existed called free bench. Under this tradition, a widow was entitled to inherit her husband's copyhold land, a form of land tenancy, as long as she remained chaste and unmarried. So far, so normal for medieval standard. But what happened if the widow didn't remain chaste? That's where the black ram enters the picture. If a widow was caught in an incontinence, medieval speak for having sex outside marriage, she forfeited her free bench rights immediately. However, some manors offered a bizarre path to redemption. The widow could regain her property by performing a public ritual that would make anyone blush. The ritual required the widow to arrive at the next manor court, riding backward on a black ram, holding the animal's tail in her hand instead of reins. Upon arrival, she had to recite a specific rhyme before the steward and assembled tenants. The rhyme varied by location, but a virgin documented from the manor of Inbourne in Berkshire went like this: "Here I am, riding upon a black ram, like a whore as I am, and for my crinkum sexual misconduct have lost my binkum bench rights, and for my tail's game am brought to this worldly shame. Therefore, good Mr. Steward, let me have my land again." This humiliating public spectacle was designed as both punishment and entertainment. Court records from the period are frustratingly unclear about how often widows actually performed this ritual versus simply forfeiting their property rights. But the custom remained officially on the books in some manors until the 19th century. What makes this law particularly strange is how it combined moral judgment with public shaming and a pathway to legal redemption, all wrapped up in bizarre theatrical elements. The backwards riding symbolized the woman's backwards or improper behavior. The black ram itself had demonic associations in medieval symbolism, connecting the widow's behavior with sinful impulses. While the black ram ritual might seem like a cruel joke, it actually represents a surprising legal flexibility. In an era when women's property rights were severely restricted, this custom, however humiliating, provided a path for fallen widows to retain economic independence, rather than losing everything due to one indiscretion. Number 2. Merchant, the medieval daughter tax. Did you know medieval fathers had to pay their lords for permission to let their daughters marry? This bizarre fee, called merch, or maiden rent, was one of the most resented payments peasants had to make to their lords. Merchant required a peasant to pay a substantial fee to his lord whenever his daughter married the justification. Since daughters might marry men from outside the manor, the lord would lose a potential worker and any future children she might have had. The payment supposedly compensated the lord for this loss. The fee varied widely, depending on local custom and the lord's greed. In some places, it might be a few shillings. In others, it could amount to several years' worth of a peasant's income. Some particularly opportunistic lords even claimed the right to set the amount based on the bride's beauty or desirability, effectively placing a market value on young women. What made merchant particularly intrusive was that, technically, the lord's permission was required before the marriage could take place. Court records show cases of peasants being heavily fined for arranging their daughters' marriages secretly to avoid paying merchant. There are even documented instances of lords refusing permission for marriages they disliked, giving them remarkable control over peasant family formation. The practice varied across Medieval Europe, in some regions, merchant applied only to the marriages of unfree tenants, serfs, or villeins. In others, even free tenants had to pay some form of the fee, though usually at a lower rate. In the most extreme cases, lords claimed merchant, not just for daughters, but for sisters, nieces, and even mothers of their tenants. Perhaps the most humiliating aspect of merchant was that it was sometimes associated with an older, more sinister custom, the supposed right of the first night, jus primae noctis. While historians debate whether this right was ever widely exercised in reality, the association linked merchant with sexual dominance and humiliation. Some lords may have used the threat of claiming this supposed right to extract higher merchant payments. Peasants resisted merchant in various ways. Some families pooled resources to pay a daughter's merchant. Others arranged secret marriages, risking punishment if discovered. In some communities, collective bargaining gradually reduced merchant to a token payment. By the late medieval period, as serfdom declined, merchant payments became less common, though they persisted in some conservative regions until surprisingly late. The merchant system reveals how deeply medieval power structures reached into family life. Not only did lords control peasants' economic lives through labor obligations and various taxes, but they also inserted themselves into the most personal family decisions about marriage and reproduction. Number 1. Coverture, the legal death of medieval wives. Would you willingly give up your legal identity? For medieval women, marriage meant exactly that. A complete legal erasure, so thorough it was called civil death. The legal principle of coverture was perhaps the strangest and most far-reaching medieval inheritance law, and its effects shaped women's lives for centuries. Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. As the legal commentator, William Blackstone, would later put it, the husband and wife are one person in law, and that one person is the husband. This wasn't just a romantic notion of unity, it was a brutal legal reality that stripped married women of nearly all property rights. Before marriage, a woman could own property, make contracts, and sue or be sued in court. The moment she said, "I do," all her existing property automatically became her husband's. Any income she earned belonged to him. She couldn't sign binding contracts. She couldn't bring lawsuits without her husband joining the case. Her husband gained legal control over all her inheritance, including land that had been in her family for generations. This legal doctrine created bizarre situations. If a wife was injured, her husband had to sue for damages, because technically he owned her body and its capacities. If someone owed a married woman money, her husband had the exclusive right to collect it. A wife couldn't even make a valid will without her husband's permission, because technically she owned nothing to bequeath. The justification for coverture was supposedly protection. A husband would manage property better and look after his wife's interests. The reality, however, was often financial disaster for women. Court records contain countless cases of husbands who squandered their wives' inheritances on gambling, drinking, or failed business ventures, leaving formerly wealthy women destitute. Some limited protections existed. A woman's dowry was supposed to be protected for her benefit, though husbands frequently found ways around these restrictions. Wealthy families sometimes created prenuptial-like agreements called marriage settlements that placed property in trust for the wife's separate use. But these protections were available mainly to the elite. What made coverture particularly strange was its selective application. A married woman lost almost all property rights but retained criminal liability. If she committed a crime, she couldn't hide behind coverture with limited exceptions, if her husband directly coerced her. She was legally incapable of signing a binding contract, yet fully responsible for her criminal actions. The principle of coverture persisted with remarkable tenacity. While other medieval laws were reformed or abandoned over time, coverture remained firmly entrenched in English common law until the late 19th century, when married women's property acts finally began dismantling this legal death. Did medieval people ever question these bizarre inheritance and dowry customs? Were these laws simply accepted as normal, or did our ancestors also find them as strange as we do today? The answer might surprise you. Court records show numerous challenges to these systems, suggesting that even in the Middle Ages, people recognized the injustice of laws that treated women and daughters as property to be traded, taxed, and controlled. Perhaps human nature hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe after all.